All right, so today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the evidence, excuse me, that we have now that evolution does exactly, or does in fact take place. So remember, Darwin had some hints, and remember, he proposed a hypothesis, but this has now become a theory. So it's become very well tested. We have a lot of evidence. So what evidence do we have that evolution is taking place? Well, the first one we're going to take a look at is what we call comparative anatomy. And anatomy is the study of the body structures. So these are where we look at structural similarities, but we also look at structural differences because similarities show that perhaps they had what we call a common ancestor. What you have to understand with evolution is, and I hear this a lot, for instance, humans evolved from monkeys. That is actually incorrect. What we actually have back in time is what we call a common ancestor. So basically we have, a merging of our family tree, if you will, with that common ancestor. And that common ancestor split and created things like monkeys and then things like humans. So it's not that we're better, it's just that we're different. And if we go back in our history, we have that common link. It's kind of like, if you meet a relative of yours and you go back and you figure out what relative you guys actually have in common. Like, for instance, with your cousins, your common relative, your common ancestor would be your grandparents. That's what we're actually talking about here. So if we look at the structural similarities and also the structural differences, we can kind of use that to try to figure out where on the family tree the different organisms might be. Because the presence of certain types of similarities is evidence for evolutionary relationships. Now, you do have to be careful a little bit with anatomy because sometimes things do appear that are in things that aren't related at all. For instance, like a bat wing and a bird wing. Wings are wings, and obviously they look very different. They function the same. But in terms of the structure of some of the bones in there, they are very similar. But you have to go pretty far back in the family tree to actually link up birds, which are mammals, and birds, which are not mammals. They're in the class of aves, and bats, which are mammals. We can also look at things like homologous structures. Homologous structures show similar structure and sometimes similar development, but again, different forms and different functions. So again, this gives evidence of a common ancestor. And I talked about a bat versus a bird. We can actually look at the bones in a human arm and the bones in a bat wing, and we will see that they actually both sets have the same bone structure. They're just arranged a little bit differently, and obviously the ones in the bat wing are used for flying, whereas we don't fly as humans, we use our arms for different functions. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Vestigial structures are basically structures that are remnants, that were functional and maybe in ancestral form, but are no longer functional. For instance, if you look at the skeletons of whales and snakes, they actually have hind leg bones. Now, we know that neither whales nor snakes have hind legs, so they don't need to use those bones at all.
Hey, can you do me a favor?
All right, sorry about that. Mr. Phillips needed me for something. So the next evidence of evolution we have is comparative embryology. So embryology has to do with how animals and organisms actually develop prior to being born. So we're looking at the embryological development of different species. And again, this provides evidence of common ancestry. Now, this is kind of hard to picture without actually seeing something. So what I have here are actually 4 different pictures. One of these is a dog, one of these is a human, one of these is a pig, and one of these is a whale. So this top one here is the dog. This one down here below it is your pig. The one down here is the whale, and believe it or not, this one here that kind of looks like a little lizard is the human. But you can see they look very similar, and they're in similar stages of development, which they're all mammals, so that makes sense. But if you looked at the organisms side by side in their adult form, you wouldn't see that. The next one is the comparative cytology. So we actually look at the cells and we look at the cell's structure. What is present, what is absent, how do they operate? So that's pretty straightforward. The comparative biochemistry is actually kind of interesting. You look at the DNA and you look at the proteins, and you can determine the degree of the evolutionary relationship based on the protein or the DNA. And this is actually really kind of the cutting edge of evolution now, that we can sequence DNA and actually look at the differences in the bases. So for example, you can compare pig, cow, sheep insulin to human insulin. And the synthetic insulin that we actually tend to use for diabetics that are insulin dependent is actually sheep. We're actually closest related to that. But for other things, we actually use pig, like for instance, pig valves for hearts and different things like that. The last major piece of this is the fossil record. And this actually provides a very detailed record of evolution. The fossils were formed in different layers of rock, and they're preserved there. So as you go from the top down, you actually get evidence of gradual change over time. So the top layer fossils are younger, in other words, more recent, and the bottom layer fossils are older, or more ancient. Okay, sorry about that again. For the pauses here. I keep getting interrupted. All right, so you want to turn in your handout packet, and we're actually going to skip over the natural selection one here and go to the one that says relative age. So sedimentary rock layers form in order by age. The oldest layers are on the bottom, and more recent layers lie above them in the order in which they formed. So the first thing we need to do here is to number the rock layers in the order they formed. The first one has been done for you. So when we say number 1, we mean that that is actually the oldest of our rock layers. So if you think about it, if this is the oldest, then we're going to get the next layer laid down right on top, followed by the next layer. So second layer, third layer, fourth layer, fifth layer, sixth layer, and that would be the newest layer because it doesn't look like there's true rock above there. All right, so the next thing we need to do is use the diagram of the rock layers to number the fossils in order. Okay, the oldest fossil, labeled 1, which is right here. Okay, and if you notice, that picture corresponds with rock layer 1, has been done for you. So if we look at the second oldest rock layer, this is the fossil that we find there. In the next rock layer, we find this one. In the next one, we find this one. In the next one, we find this one. And the last one, we find that one. All right, so the question at the bottom. Suppose that you found a fossil of the same species as fossil 1 in a rock layer at another location. What could you conclude about that rock layer? Well, what you can conclude is that those rock layers are the same age because they contain the same fossils. All right, if you turn the page over to where it says the fossil record, in the fossil record, an intermediate form is a fossil that shows some characteristics of an earlier related organism. The illustrations below show organisms whose fossils make up part of the fossil record. The organisms are in order from oldest, organism 1, to most recent, organism 4. So what we need to do is we actually need to draw an animal that might have been an intermediate form between organism 1 and organism 2. Okay, so between these guys. So let's start with that one, and then we'll do another one between organism 3 and organism 4. So if we look at the differences here, we're going to make this shell a little bit longer, a little bit more narrow, okay, and then he's going to kind of come out, and he's got his tentacles and his eye. Okay, so it's a little bit longer. You can make it a little bit skinnier even if you want. And between organism 3 and organism 4, we're going to find that we have a little bit more curlicue here on the shell. Not as much as in organism 4, but more than in organism 3. And again, we're going to have him coming out with his tentacles and give him his eye. Okay, so something along those lines. You can add in some of the divisions on the shell if you wish. Okay, you don't have to be the best artist in the world, but you just need to make something that looks kind of what would be in between for both of those. So, describe one change you see between organism 1 and organism 2. Well, the shell gets longer and it definitely gets skinnier. So, how might these fossils provide evidence for evolution? Because they show that these organisms have changed over time. They really haven't changed in terms of their, overall. I mean, we're not looking at a mouse and a rabbit, for instance, but you can actually see how one changed into the other, that it's a logical progression here. All right, now, evidence of evolution. Use the words below and your knowledge of the evidence for evolution to complete the table. The first one has been done for you. So homologous body structures are where we have animals with different limb structures that develop from the same embryonic tissues evolved from a common ancestor. All right, vertebrates share a common ancestor as shown by how these organisms develop. So this one is going to be similarities, because we've got that development piece there in embryo development. Intermediate forms show that organisms have evolved over time. That is the fossil record. That's what it provides to us. It actually can show us those intermediate forms preserved. And species have adapted over time to local conditions. This one is the geographic distribution of living species. All right, so the question down at the bottom. Give an example of homologous body structures. I'm just going to use the one we used in our notes, which was the human arm and the bat wing. And the last handout for this section of notes is the genetic evidence of common ancestors. So all of these things are tying in with the different evidence pieces that we have. So biologists compare DNA sequences to determine evolutionary relationships. The more similar the DNA sequences of two species are, the more recently the two species shared a common ancestor. Each picture in the diagram represents a gene. Each shaded portion of a gene represents a mutation. Excuse me. So, we're going to use this diagram to answer the questions. So, which species is most closely related to species B? So, if we look at species B, okay, it is most closely related to species C. Now, let's explain why. So, how did we use the DNA sequences to answer question 1? Well, you remember, you have to talk about the DNA here. You can't just say, oh, well, they're closest on the tree. That doesn't work. Okay, if you look at species B, it has 2 mutations that are in common with species C. But if you look at species B and species A, they have none in common. Okay, so that's how we can, the mutations that are there show that those two are more closely related. So how can you tell that species C developed with from the organism with gene number 3 on the chart? That's because 2 of the mutations in species C are the same as the one that is in gene 3. So our next step, you do have a video clip to watch on evidence of evolution, but then your next activity is actually going to be a lab dealing with evidence of evolution.